Welcome to Series 10, Session 12 of A Love for the Bible. This is Dave Clark. Last week, I interviewed my son David on his Bible reading over the last month, and we particularly focused on the books of Joel and Esther. And he was inspired by one of the prophecies of Joel, and he also found Esther as a good example of someone that took prayer to heart. Well, today I'm going to be focusing on chapter 10 of the book I wrote called A Heart for the Bible. And I'm going to read the first part of this chapter to help us to better get an idea of an overview of the Bible. So let me go ahead and get started. Having the broader picture in mind. Before we read any book, it's helpful to have a vision for what it will be saying. And this helps us before we read it so we can get the most out of it. So I could take one example would be a mystery fiction book. And one fiction book I've enjoyed is Agatha Christie. Now she has her own unique style of doing mysteries. And one of the things is basically a whodunit. You try to figure out who's responsible for the murder. So it's kind of a whodunit book, and you try to see who that mystery killer was. Well, so helping me to know this better knows what to expect when I read this book. Now, another example would be a motivational nonfiction book. And maybe I might read this to improve myself in some way. But I would want to know something about that book and what's the author's basic approach. So, for example, if me being of the Christian faith, I would likely be looking for a book that takes the Christian perspective. Well, I think it's also valuable to have an idea of the Bible and what it's all about before you start reading it, particularly if you're going to read it all the way through. So I would like to help you to see some of the key things, such as how is the Bible arranged? What are the basic themes? And I think that having a sense of this will help in your understanding it when you do read it. So let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to look at the structure of the Bible. Now, I would divide it into two central divisions, and which you're probably familiar with. It's the Old Testament and the New Testament. But why are these old and new? Well, first of all, the Old Testament, it has historical books. It has what I would call relationship of God and man, and prophetic books. And then the New Testament has Gospels about Jesus and the early church. The epistles are letters to churches, and what I call future expectations. But if we were to look at them very broadly, the Old Testament versus the New Testament, I think we could say the Old Testament tells about the original agreement between God and man. That's why it's called the Old Testament. And the New Testament tells about a new agreement between God and man as revealed in Jesus. So that's why Old Testament and New Testament. Now let's get a little bit more about the structure. Now, as far as the Old Testament, the old historical books will describe revelations by God through historical events, what we can learn through historical events. And this is in particular the Israelite people. Remember, they escaped from Egypt and they went to the promised land, but there's many lessons that were learned and that we can learn from the experience of the Israelite people. Now, God and man is more kind of individual, personal testimonies. And that would be like with David. What is this experience of David? Of Job. Job, we know he suffered, but he learned. and Solomon. And Solomon shared his insights. So these are a lot specific revelations about man and about God. Now, if we go to the prophecy in the Old Testament, this is more prophetic. And it's like Isaiah and Jeremiah are examples of prophets, and they're telling about future events. So this is a prophetic books, and that comes next in the Old Testament. Now let's go to the New Testament. Well, it starts with the Gospels, and that's about the life of Jesus, and that's by 4 different authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they each say it a little bit a different perspective. And John's approach is probably the most personal and intimate of the 4 books. Now we go to the next book, which is the book of Acts. And that describes the actions of the first Christian churches. And as after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So what happened with them? What tells the story between the first churches, the first people, the disciples, after the death and resurrection of Jesus? And so that's a very interesting story. Now, then you have the epistles. Now, this is really letters that are written by leaders like Paul and Peter and John. And they're basically they're letters to churches, and they're motivating them, and they're helping them to learn. So these are letters that we learn about them ourselves. And finally, there is future expectations. And that's what I would say is Revelation. And it's really telling about the future. It tells a little bit about the churches right then, but also goes on to the future. And it's really predictions of future. And this is revealed to the Apostle John. So I hope that this has been helpful for you to get a general idea of the Bible. And I hope that it will help you in your future reading. So I want to thank our listeners for joining me. And my next podcast will be Series 10, Session 13. And that will air beginning Tuesday, October 8th at 8 a.m.